Can you, can you explain how the Christian principle of it's not about me matches up with the principles of individual liberty, question mark? I'm having trouble merging the concepts. Now I see the Christian culture getting slaughtered in this area with the situation that we're having, especially in our state of Washington. And it's really messing us up on where we stand because they're trying to be loving, but they don't understand this biblical concept. So what would you say to this, Pastor Steve?
I would just say it's not about me.
And that's it?
And that's it. It's not about me. And so when I, so for example, Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about, let me get there so I can share it with you. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he says in verse 13, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." And so that's straightforward. I'm supposed to be a good citizen, is what's being spoken about there. But then you have the same guy in the book of Acts. And so in the book of Acts, Peter and John specifically are out sharing the gospel with people. And actually there's a situation where Peter takes a guy who's lame, and God uses him to heal the person. 5,000 people get saved because of this whole thing. And then they're called before the Sanhedrin. Peter specifically is called before the Sanhedrin, and he witnesses to those guys, and they come up with the attitude where they say, verse 18 of chapter 4 of Acts, they called them and commanded them not to speak at all, nor teach in the name of Jesus. And so the Sanhedrin is the governing body of Israel. This is like being taken before the Senate. It's like being taken before the executive branch of the United States. These are the governors of Israel. And Peter says to that, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge, for we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. And then he does it again in Acts chapter 5. And so this tells you how far submission is supposed to go. My submission to the government, my submission to mankind only goes as far as they don't contradict what Scripture has to say. They don't contradict the Bible. If they're telling me to do something that the Bible tells me not to do, or they're telling me not to do something that the Bible tells me to do, then I am not to obey them. I'm to obey God rather than men. And that's what Peter and John said in chapter 5. We obey God, not men. And so that's where that whole thing comes down. So when they closed down churches, there was a period of time where it was reasonable, because they said, 2 weeks and we'll be over the hump and everything will be fine and we can move on. And then they came out, our governor came out with his 4-phase plan. And I read in the 4-phase plan that churches weren't going to be open. 50 people. When we get to phase 4. It was ridiculous.
With no date on phase 4.
Yeah, exactly. And nothing after that, which is what we have right now. We're starting the 3rd year of this nonsense. And we're still under emergency orders from the governor. And that's because he's taking advantage of the situation. Okay, the other thing that needs to be brought in on this whole thing is it says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And so, is Governor Inslee our king?
No.
Nope, he is not. Is Joe Biden our king? Nope, he is not. Is Nancy Pelosi the king? Nope, she is not. We live in a constitutional republic. And so the king is the Constitution.
Yep.
That's the king. If you're looking for a standard for government in the United States, it is the Constitution. That's why we have a Supreme Court, and that's why they routinely deem laws unconstitutional. And so we don't have to obey them because they're unconstitutional. And it doesn't matter if an executive has signed it or if a legislative branch has put it forth. It does not matter if it does not conform to the Constitution. And so Constitution is king in the United States. We don't have an emperor. We don't have a king. And when we're looking at those kinds of situations, again, if a guy who is in governing authority tells me to do something that is specifically against the law, and just because he is a governing authority, I go out and do it, I'm disobeying God at that point. And so we have the law of God, and we're supposed to be submitting to what God has said, and nobody gets to contradict that. If God has said something, I'm going to do it, and it doesn't matter if a governor or anybody else tells me not to, right? Then you have the whole situation with law in the United States. And so it doesn't matter if it's a police officer, or if it's a representative, or if it's a governor, or if it's the president of the United States. If he tells me to do something that is illegal, goes against what law and the Constitution says, I'm not to do that. It's at that point that I'm supposed to stop and say, no, I'm not going to do that, because I am a citizen of the United States, and people don't get to come in and get to take over and say that you're going to do what I say instead of what the Constitution says. And that's the basis for our government. And so none of that has to do with me, is the point that I'm making.
Right.
So obeying God does not have to do with me. And obeying the Constitution does not have to do with me. Obeying the laws of the land do not have to do with me. Disobeying an elected official who goes against the law does not have to do with me. It's law, it's order, it's constitutionality, it's biblical standards for these things. What the Bible has to say about this, and none of that has to do with me. And so that's what I mean by it's not about me. It's not about my rights. It's not about that kind of stuff. I think it's silly that people are giving up their rights, but I think that Christians are arguing from the wrong position.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are things in the Constitution. There are things that have been put there. They're rights, and those are the things that are legal, and people don't get to come in and change those without going through the process.
God really values individual liberty, because when you look at, does he want everybody to go to heaven?
Yeah.
The lengths that he went to, the cross, the most excruciating, the most you could give or sacrifice, crucifixion, shows how much he loves and wants people to come to heaven. But he loves individual liberty so much, he will not violate their free will.
Exactly.
In that situation. So from that, we know if he thinks this is so important that he died for it, but he won't violate our free will and allows us to choose, then individual liberty is something that's important. So the trap that they set when, and this is what they say, oh, well, you value freedom and liberty over safety. Now, I know the science, and we've talked about that before, and all the stuff that goes along with that, and the mandates and stuff like that, but it's a total lie on the face, is that to be a tyrant and run people's lives is not loving.
Right.
And the whole, well, you care about yourself over safety, it's totally convoluted, and not even the Lord himself looks at these issues that way. It's a precious thing, individual liberty.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, you have to be free. Bible teaches that we need to obey God. I have to be free to obey God.
Yep.
I have to, no governing authority gets to overstep their bounds in my relationship with God. And so I have to be free to do that. And if the government doesn't give me freedom to do that, I take it. And I can take the consequences too, but I take it. And they don't, it's like I don't abandon that, and I don't abdicate that. If they tell me to do something, again, that is unscriptural or on any kind of level, they don't get to do that with me.
Right.
Right. So, again.
And we're out of time, but, our country was founded on men wrestling with these principles.
Uh-huh.
And they took those foundational principles that you just laid out. And that's why we have our Constitution, because King George was doing this, and they're like, no. And a lot of these guys were pastors. Right. They would teach about this on a Sunday morning. And man, we've negated this understanding so much that we as Christians go, oh, well, we don't need to worry about politics. And it's totally a spiritual thing that we've negated.
Right. You don't worry about something, Satan takes it over.
Exactly.
That's the problem with that kind of attitude. And so this is one of those areas that it's pretty straightforward. It's not a hard thing. I don't have to be selfish to be free. I need to be somebody who follows what God has to say. And so I got to have principles down. So I think that Americans are in need of civics lessons because we don't obey men. We obey the Constitution. That's what oaths are given to. You don't have an oath given to the President of the United States. You don't have an oath that's given to the governor of Washington State. You don't have an oath that's given to a mayor. You don't swear fealty to these people. It's anytime an oath is given in the United States, it's to the Constitution and against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's how important this was with the Founding Fathers. One of the things about the Founding Fathers is that they're smarter than anybody that that's having a problem with the Constitution.
Yeah.
All the people that I've seen having issues with the Constitution are not smart, and they have an agenda.
And they used to make you put your hand on the Bible when you were swearing in for that
exactly.
ceremonies.
One of the things about the Constitution itself and the reason it's set up the way it is because these guys knew that people are sinners, and that tyranny is something that a group of people can easily fall into.
Great point. It's throughout all their writings when they were developing it, they were worried about all these things.
Yep.
That's why you get the great quotes of, when they came out, what do you have? A constitution if you can keep it, because they were so worried about.
Right.
Because they knew that we were sinners.
Yep.
All right, guys, great show. Thanks for joining in. If you have questions, send them to me, crosswalkradio@gmail.com. You can text me, 707-872-7677.